So I woke up today and I got some of the best news that I've ever had in my entire life, because I just found out that YouTube's original grifter, Tai Lopez, was just sued by the SEC for allegedly running a $112 million Ponzi scheme. So needless to say, I'm having a pretty good day. It's basically a national holiday at this point, in my opinion. Now, if you don't know, if you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that I have a superpower. I don't like to talk about it very much. A very humble man. But I have a superpower. I'm able to predict the future when it comes to these scammers. Can't get a lottery ticket, numbers or anything like that. But I know what's going to happen with these scammers. And I actually predicted this all the way back in March of 2023. I put out a video, Tai Lopez $240 million Ponzi scheme, where I talked about the company that specifically led to the lawsuit that the SEC now has against Tai Lopez. Now, the SEC, we have different numbers. I said $240 million. They sued him for $112 million. That's all right. We can have little differences there, SEC. I'm not going to hold that against you. I think it was a lot more than he scammed people out of, but that's all right. We'll settle our differences there, right? But we're actually going to take a look at the lawsuit in this video. But before we get into the actual lawsuit, break it down. Obviously, this was 2 years ago that I talked about this. Break down what exactly this company was, which led to this now lawsuit against Tai Lopez. So back in 2019, Tai Lopez and another man, Alex Marr, who was the co-founder of a dating site called Zeus, that's how he made a bunch of money. So Tai Lopez and Alex decided to start a new company called Retail Ecommerce Ventures. Now, Retail Ecommerce Ventures was a holding company that was designed to buy a bunch of distressed, in many cases bankrupt companies, retail companies, companies that had a lot of retail physical locations, and they were going to sell off all the retail locations and reinvent these companies as e-commerce juggernauts, right? So they bought a bunch of dying companies. Tuesday morning, bodybuilding.com. I don't really know why they bought bodybuilding.com, since that was already primarily mostly online. Pier 1, Radio Shack, Wilhelmina, Ralph and Russo, Dress Barn, Steinmart, Linens and Things, Medela Sports, and many other. They bought a bunch of these companies through Retail Ecommerce Ventures, and they were going to turn them into internet juggernauts. Now, what's interesting, in most of these companies already had very large online presences, but for whatever reason, Tai Lopez thought he could do it better than these multi-million-dollar companies. I'm going to do it better. I'm going to make these companies super profitable, even though most of them are already bankrupt and losing a bunch of money. I'm going to fix them, guys. I'm going to fix them. Now, Tai Lopez and his buddy Alex, they didn't want to, put all their money in and risk all their money. So they eventually got a bunch of investors to give them the money to purchase all of these companies. They ran a bunch of ads. I think they ran several ads on YouTube.
If you're an accredited investor, I have something I think you're going to want to listen to. I consider it big news, but in a sense, it's old news.
And ultimately, they were able to get hundreds of millions of dollars from these investors to buy these different companies for their holding company, Retail Ecommerce Ventures, or otherwise just known as REV. Now, primarily, the reason they are now being sued is primarily two reasons. First off, they were allegedly lying to investors and telling investors that these companies were making a bunch of money, when in reality they were losing money and basically bankrupt. They were getting a bunch of money from new. The other issue of why they were getting sued, allegedly, was they were running a Ponzi scheme where they were getting new money from new investors and using the money from the new investors to pay back the old investors, which is the very definition of a Ponzi scheme. Take money from the new investors, give it to the old investors and say, look, we made a bunch of money through our company. No, it was money from one person to the next. So the old hat trick, basically, right? And so those are the two primarily reasons why Alex and Tai Lopez and another person we'll get into are now being sued by the SEC, alleging that they are running a Ponzi scheme. Now, before we get into the lawsuit, I just want to say this all could have been avoided, Tai. If Tai just had a little bit more knowledge, just needs more knowledge. If you don't know Tai and his infamous video, I think he had like 7 bookshelves installed in his garage to house all of his books so he could gain all that knowledge. And I think the real issue was Tai just didn't have enough bookshelves. I think if Tai had had 14 bookshelves in his garage, he would have had the knowledge to understand that this was a bad idea, and he never would have done it.
Here in my garage, just bought this new Lamborghini here. It's fun to drive up here in the Hollywood Hills. But you know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. In fact, I'm a lot more proud of these 7 new bookshelves that I had to get installed to hold 2,000 new books that I bought. It's like the billionaire Warren Buffett says, the more you learn, the more you earn.
All right, so this is the actual lawsuit right here. It is 31 pages. We're not going to take a look at the entire thing because a lot of it is just kind of boring. We'll take a look at the really interesting part of the actual lawsuit. So this is the United States District Court, Southern District of Florida, case number Securities and Exchange Commission is the plaintiff versus Tai Lopez, Alexander Farhang Mar, that is the other co-founder who made a bunch of money as the co-founder of Zeus. When he sold that, he made a bunch of money. And then Maya Rose Birkenroad. Now, Maya is really interesting. She's the third person on the list. Maya, I believe, is the actual cousin of Tai Lopez. And Tai put her in charge without any... She's never run companies before. He put her in charge, the COO of the company of Rev. We'll get into that later in the lawsuit, but that's why she is involved in the lawsuit as well. So let's go over the introduction. It says, from approximately April 2020 through November 2022, the relevant period, defendants Tai Lopez and Alexander Mar, co-founders of Retail Ecommerce Ventures, and Rev's chief operating officer, Maya Birkenroad, raised approximately $112 million combined from hundreds of investors through fraudulent offerings from retail investors across the United States through the fraudulent offer and sale of securities issued by 8 Rev portfolio companies managed by Rev and which defendants formed and controlled. Now, what's interesting is Rev was actually started way back in 2019, but they're saying the actual scam portion of it started in April of 2020. Now, if we go to part 3, it says, during the relevant period, defendants sold securities in the form of unsecured notes, promising up to 25% annualized returns, as well as equity membership units, with a monthly preferential dividend as high as 2%. So they were offering a preferential dividend, a payment on your of 2% per month. The purported purpose of the offering was to raise capital to acquire the predecessor to each particular Rev retail brand and to raise additional operating capital for said Rev retail brand. So they're offering 25% annualized returns, which is just not something any legitimate company or like stockbroker is ever going to say, yeah, I can give you 25% annualized returns. Not going to happen. So that's like, that should have been the first red flag to any of these investors. 25% annually returns and 2% monthly dividends. Yeah, that sounds too good to be true. In at least one promotional video publicly available on the internet, Lopez touted Rev's approach as one of the best strategies you can invest in. Defendants further assured investors that while other businesses may be struggling, their portfolio companies were on fire and that cash flow is strong. Defendants also assured investors both orally and in written offering materials that funds raised for a specific portfolio company would be used for that specific company and that Rev and the Rev retail brands have never failed to pay a single investor. Contrary to these representations, while some of the Rev retail brands generated revenue, none generated any profits. Consequently, in order to pay interest, dividends, and maturing note payments, defendants resorted to using a combination of loans from outside lenders, merchant cash advances, money raised from new and existing investors, and transfers from other portfolio companies to cover obligations. At least $5.9 million of the returns distributed to investors were, in reality, Ponzi-like payments funded by other investments. That's pretty damning. That's not something you want to be accused of. In addition, defendants misappropriated approximately $16.1 million in investor funds, which was diverted for defendants Lopez and Mar's personal use. What do you know? According to this, Tai Lopez, the guy who a lot of people look up to, a lot of these big entrepreneurs on YouTube, they're like, oh yeah, Tai's one of the best. He started it all. He's one of the greatest guys out there. But apparently, according to the SEC, he's a massive scammer that was stealing investors' funds, allegedly, to promote his own personal lifestyle of having a bunch of Lamborghinis, buying multi-million-dollar homes. Doesn't sound too good for Tai. Now, I want to take a look at part 12, and one thing I want to say before we look at this part, I do want to say I do have some, I wouldn't say insider knowledge, but I have some behind-the-scenes knowledge as to what we're going to talk about right here. So it says, Rev is an insolvent Delaware limited liability company with its principal place of business in Miami Beach, Florida. Defendants Lopez and Mar are the majority owners of Rev, which served as the manager of the Rev retail brands. Rev raised approximately $112 million from investors by issuing unsecured notes and equity in Rev. On December 29, 2023, the assets of Rev and the Rev retail brands were foreclosed on by a group of secured Rev note holders, and the assets were reassigned to a new unrelated company, Omni Retail Enterprises. Now, I covered this back in 2023, like I did in that past video, and I was actually invited into a investor group chat of all the people who were scammed over by Rev, by Tai Lopez and the other guy, Alex. And they were thinking about suing Tai all the way back in 2023 because the company wasn't making any money, and they were aware of that, right? Now, ultimately, Tai and Alex avoided a lawsuit from the investors because they gave all the ownership of all of the companies that Rev owned to the investors. So the investors are now the owners of Omni Retail Enterprises. Tai and Alex are not a part of that. They now own all of the companies, and I wish them the best. They put $112 million into that, and most of these companies are probably going to go bankrupt. I hope that they can get some money out of the $112 million they lost from that. But that's what happened. They are now the investors are now owners of that. Tai and Rev are no longer owners of anything involved with all of those companies I mentioned earlier. All right, so part 25, it says, during the relevant period, defendants raised more than $230 million from at least 660 investors nationwide, including raising approximately $112 million through a series of fraudulent security offerings in the 8 Rev retail brands. So that's why my initial video was titled $244 million, right? Because initially I had heard from investors that Tai and his business partner Alex had raised much more money than initially. I think it was like 120 that people were saying initially. So they are acknowledging in the SEC lawsuit that they raised about $230 million, but ultimately they're only saying that $112 million of that was fraudulent securities, which is what they're going after him for. All right, so this part is really interesting. It goes over how much they were offering investors a return on their investment. So Rev and the portfolio companies, including Rev's retail brands, at the direction of defendants, offered and sold securities to investors in the form of unsecured notes and or equity membership units. For each type of offering, investors typically first entered into a letter of intent, followed by a securities purchase agreement. These LOIs and agreements offered unsecured note investors annualized returns as high as 25% for terms ranging from 1 to 7 years, and promised note holders a full return of their investment principal upon maturity. Equity investors were offered preferential monthly dividends of up to 2%. The following lists the issuer's dates, types of securities issues, and promised rates of return for the 8 Rev retail brand offerings. So one of the companies they had bought was Brahms, offering date 21 to 2022, equity. You were going to get if you invested in their Brahms company, you were going to get a monthly dividend return of 1.5% and an annual interest 1 to 7 year note of 13.5 to 25%. That is insane. Their other company, Models, offering in 2022, you would get a monthly dividends equity of 2%, and annual interest of 21 to 25%. Those returns cannot be guaranteed by any legitimate investment company. If you ever see someone guaranteeing a 25% yearly return, you run. First you call the government. You say, hey, they're scamming people. And then you run away. And you don't get involved in that because no one can guarantee a 25% yearly return. According to at least one investor, defendant Lopez claimed that the portfolio companies were able to pay such high returns because Rev acquired the business so cheaply. So here's what happened according to the SEC after investors sent Tai money. After investors sent in their investment capital, investors received an unsecured note or a securities purchase agreement for execution. Defendants Lopez Mar or Birkenrode countersigned these investors' notes and agreements. The unsecured notes and equity membership units defendants offered and sold are securities within the meaning of the Securities Act and the Exchange Act. Ooh, you don't want to get got by that by the SEC. Saying that you're selling unsecured security. That's not good. Let's go over at 44. It says, defendants Lopez and Mar also boasted to investors that the Rev and the Rev retail brands never missed a payment to a single investor. In particular, one investor recalled in May 2022 investor Zoom call where defendant Lopez stated that Rev never missed a cash payment or preferred payment since inception. Defendants Lopez and Marr claims about never missing a payment to investors were also false. From at least early 2022, investors had already complained to defendant Lopez, Marr, Birkenroad, and other Rev representatives that they had not received their interest payment. Now, that is something I had heard as well. I think I talked about that in the previous video. I was in that group chat. Many of the people had not been receiving any payments, even though they were supposed to get monthly dividend returns, and yearly returns. Many of the individuals had not been receiving returns about a year at that point. That was in 2023. So it was about a year at that point. They had not been receiving any returns. So they were lying to people, allegedly, according to this, that they had never missed a payment when in reality they had. Defendants knew that Rev and the Rev retail brands were in financial trouble. During several internal Rev meetings in mid-2022, defendant Lopez and Marr discussed the overall financial situation with defendant Birkenroad, as well as the need to raise additional capital and have to prioritize vendor payments and triage investor payments. Despite the financial struggle of the Rev retail brands, the defendant continued to promote new offerings by touting the purported success of the Rev retail brands. All right, so this part is really interesting. We get into defendant Birkenroad, and we find out who she is, right? So it says, defendant Lopez and Marr misrepresented the experience of a key member of Rev's leadership team on their website. Specifically, defendant Birkenroad, who served as Rev's president, COO, chief risk officer, and who also served in an executive capacity for Pier 1 and Dress Barn, was described on the website as Rev's president and as having over 10 years of experience managing multi-million-dollar companies. Contrary to the information stated on Rev's website, in the years prior to working as Rev's president and COO, defendant Birkenroad worked as a substitute preschool teacher, a promoter at a radio station, as an assistant to her cousin Lopez in his online education company. Defendant Birkenroad had no identifiable experience managing any company. So that is who Tai and Alex made Rev's president, COO, and chief risk officer. Tai's cousin, who had no idea, no experience running companies like this. Now, in my personal opinion, again, I don't know. I'm just guessing here. I would assume that they kind of like put her out there as kind of like the scapegoat. Hey, you're the president of Rev. We're gonna run it, but you're the president. You're the CEO. They named her the chief risk officer. I don't know. It seems like Tai was kind of throwing his cousin under the bus there. So the lawsuit goes further and talks about how basically Rev, Tai, and Birkenroad, they were moving money around because none of these companies were profitable, and they had different notes at different times that they had to pay out to different people. So they were moving money allegedly between the different companies in order to continue to pay out. So it says Rev's head bookkeeper prepared a weekly spreadsheet that he shared with defendant Birkenroad. This spreadsheet detailed bank account balances, expenses, and other cash outflows, including investor payments owed and shortfalls for each of the companies. Defendant Birkenroad shared this information with defendants Lopez and Marr, and the group would determine from where to pull funds to cover any shortfalls. Rev's head bookkeeper then executed transfers based on the instructions related to him by defendant Birkenroad. For example, when a large number of investor notes were coming due in 2022, defender Birkenroad instructs the head bookkeeper how to cover the shortfalls by directing him what amounts to take from which bank accounts. So they were commingling funds between the different bank accounts of the companies that they owned. They actually give an example on part 69. It says, for example, on one occasion, the defendants transferred $1.41 million from Radio Shack's bank account to Rev's bank account on February 4th, 2022. That same day, Rev made 5 transfers to 5 different Rev retail brands, totaling an amount of just over $1 million. Pier 1 got $615,000, Medell's $185,000, Linen & Things got $10,000, Franklin Mint got $16,000, and Dress Barn got $225,000. So they were moving, like I said, they were moving funds around in order to make it seem like the companies could still continue to pay out the dividends that they were responsible to investors, at least according to what the SEC is saying in this lawsuit. So part 71, it says Ponzi-like payments to investors. Since defendants promised investors high rates of returns but were cash flow negative and unable to generate sufficient revenues from Rev's touted business model to cover expenses, defendants needed new investors' money to make interest, dividend, and principal payments to existing investors. But if the number of companies and investors grew, so did the amount of promised returns and principals owed to investors. In order to maintain the appearance of a successful business, defendants started operating a Ponzi scheme by making payments of promised returns to existing investors using either new investors' funds or investors' funds from other Rev retail brands. From July 2022 to October 2022 alone, defendants directed at least $5.9 million in new investor funds be used to pay returns to earlier investors in classic Ponzi-like fashion. Defendant Lopez, Mar, and Birkenrode together approved these payments to earlier investors. Ultimately, Rev and the Rev retail brands began making late payments to investors at least as early as August 2022. Defendant Lopez and Mar misappropriated approximately $12.5 million and $3.6 million respectively by diverting investors' funds to personal accounts owned or controlled by them for no apparent business purposes. For example, defendant Lopez received the majority of his misappropriated funds in transfers to TAL Promotions LLC, a company wholly owned by him. TAL Promotions has no affiliation with Rev or the Rev retail brands and provides no service to either. So there you go right there. That's the basic of the actual lawsuit. The rest of it's kind of boring. But basically, the SEC is claiming that Tai and his buddies had a $112 million Ponzi scheme running. Now, this is just a civil suit, I believe, so they'll probably just have to pay a fine. Now, to be honest with you, there could be criminal charges coming up. I don't know personally. I may or may not have heard some things. I don't know. But as far as this lawsuit, this is just a civil lawsuit, so no one will be going to jail for this. But it is nice that the SEC is now calling Tai Lopez, he's a Ponzi scheme runner, right? Now, I actually reached out to Tai way back in 2023 when I did the initial video on him. I decided to do the right thing. I was going to get his opinion. Tai, these investors are accusing you of terrible things. I reached out. Tai, would you like to give your opinion on that? And he blocked me on Twitter. So now I can't actually reach out to him. Tai blocked me simply for asking questions about his company, Retail Ecommerce Venture, which now looks like a Ponzi scheme, right? So I don't know what to say about that. You can leave your comments below, but let me know below what you think about Tai being sued by the SEC for allegedly running a $100 million+ Ponzi scheme. Let me know.